DMs of Reddit, what's the most over-engineered thing that you've done in your campaigns? I once had a festival in one of my campaigns where my players participated in a tug-of-war competition. 2 teams formed, and each team rolled strength checks. Whichever team had the higher total sum would pull the rope closer to their side. The first team to pull the rope 3 points towards their side would win. Simple, right? Well, my smartass begged to differ. For some reason, I decided to factor in whether everyone was pulling in harmony with the others or not. I had a calculator open, and for each pull of each team, I calculated the standard deviation, how far from the mean each value is. Then, I compared that number for the 2 teams. Whichever team had the lower value, meaning their rolls were closer together, received a +5 bonus to their total strength roll. So, if your team rolled 3 7s, you would still beat the other team who rolled 2 10s and a 5 because your team pulled in unison, while the other team's efforts were all over the place. I made a maze on graph paper, filling the entire sheet with it. Turns out if you just follow the left wall, you get out without making any interesting decisions. Literally, the path goes left, right, and straight. We go left for 15 minutes and then done. I held a beach festival and came up with dice rules for kite building and kite fighting, and a bake-off, 3-legged races, a fishing derby, some basic casino games too, and even horse shit bingo. It was fun, but also lots of notes for hanging out at the beach. I made an entire system for some sort of horrific fusion of soccer and football, but with a massive boulder instead of a ball. Ouch! It was inspired by another game system I was in, where I heard about this awesome death soccer game that we never actually did in that campaign. So I just threw it into my own campaign out of spite. This soccer game has way too much effort put into it for the single time it was used. However, it was very memorable, and my party has even asked for a 20th level one-shot of the game to really see the chaos of it. I created a literal Lost Woods for my D&D show. It was an encounter for our 22nd and 23rd episodes, involving 20 tiles set across and rows of 5. Each tile had its normal connecting zones on the edges. Some had only 1, dead ends. Some had as many as 4, reaching the edge teleports you to another entrance somewhere on the map. I had the map set up in Foundry, the trees were walled, and each individual tile was walled, so light and line of sight were limited. I also set the map in full darkness with fog, meaning the players had to rely on light sources to navigate. The fog of war was set to non-discoverable, so when players left a tile and entered a new one, they wouldn't see the previous tile in relation to the new one. The edges would always remain a black screen. At the start of the encounter, all players rolled a d20, and the number they rolled was the tile they started on. Every player rolled a different number, save for 2 who ended up together. Party of 7 plus 1 NPC. The mechanics were that everyone had their own initiative, and once they found another person, they would link to that person's initiative and share turns. Each player or group had 2 turns worth of movement and actions. Now the goal was for the players to eventually reach tile 13 in the middle, which led to the monsters that they were hunting, and also to find tile 20, where the missing NPC was located. Meanwhile, on Initiative 20, the beast would start hunting a random player, giving them 2 turns to prepare, run, hide, or fight before the beast showed up in their tile. I used different layers of increasing music, think Dead by Daylight's terror radius for killers, that grew more intense as the creature got closer. One player nearly died trying to stand and fight the beast alone, but luckily, the NPC distracted it long enough for her to escape alive. The entire encounter was joyous to watch. I created everything a little too well. Watching players forget where they had been and double back on themselves, it let me know I created a truly difficult to navigate forest. I thought it would be fun to make my very own map. I thought it would be neat to have realistic weather patterns. That's how I ended up forcing my long-suffering meteorologist partner to sit down with me and tell me which real-life locations would correspond with regions on my map based on latitude, terrain, and the effects of continents and oceans. And the next logical step was to download weather data for those locations so I could keep it consistent. I'm just a little baby DM, so I'm sure this will not be the last time that I, if you gave a mouse a cookie, myself. So I wanted to run a Skyrim campaign since I was playing it a lot, but when I thought about how classes would convert, it felt like I'd have to reflavor a lot of stuff or ban certain classes. Things like bards, warlocks, and sorcerers are different in D&D compared to TES. So, in a move much like Skyrim's modders, I ended up overhauling 5th edition from the ground up, dumping classes almost entirely, making it a skill points game with perks and things like that. It's really fun, and it's opened the door for me to do TTRPG design in general. I've been running the Skyrim game for about 2 years now. The system is like 200 pages. I describe it as throwing a pot against the wall and reassembling it in my own image. The party was fighting a big boss in a room with a slowly spinning clockwork contraption about 50 feet in diameter, being vague because it's from an official adventure book. I disassembled a wall clock and made a raised battle map so the clockwork parts could lay flat under the map, and the clock hands would spin about 1 centimeter above it. It ended up being their favorite fight. We also ruled that if your mini touched the clock hands, you'd take lightning damage, so sometimes players had to rush their turn so the next person could take theirs and move before getting hit. I set the clock for 9 p.m. at the start of the fight, and the boss could only be truly defeated at midnight. So some characters spent their turn taking lightning damage just to move the clock hands. It was great fun. Homebrewed, borrower-inspired campaign that took place in a reimagined version of my childhood home, ending with the party piloting a Voltron-style mech to fight the family cat. Made a full, multi-tiered boss fight, including custom rules for operating the mech. Nightmare to run, but so much fun. I've created add-ons to the game before. They usually start relatively simple and then get more and more complex in response to players asking questions and trying new things. In one 3.5 game, for example, I had the players playing as moderately high-level nobles, leading their own large estates on the edge of a kingdom. At first, the rules were pretty simple. Rule 1. Everyone gets an heirloom item. When spending starting gold, you can get 1 item for half price, which was passed down to you by your family. Rule 2. You have factions that you can command to do things that make sense. But they kept talking about things their factions could do, so I made up a rule set with different skill categories their factions could specialize in, how many actions their faction can take, what roles were involved, and what special functions they had access to because a PC was leading them. Occasionally, they discovered weird items that could be used on a wider scale. One player, for example, infected a whole town to become were-leopards because it would make them more productive at lumber harvesting. It wasn't really an evil campaign, but the Sahuagin player leaned more evil than the rest of the group. If you ever want to do this in an actual game, please just look up an RPG with faction mechanics. I recently played Worlds Without Number, and it has perfectly serviceable faction mechanics that would fit nicely into a D&D game. Another time, I set up a town defense campaign. A big bad evil guy existed, but the players weren't the destined warriors this time. Instead, the big bad evil guy was moving his army of doom, causing roving bands of monsters to rush down out of the mountains during the middle of winter. The players were natives of a small town and needed to keep the town alive through the winter against waves of increasingly scary monsters. The roads were closing off, but they still had access to the town to collect stone and lumber and such. On the huge town map, there were 3 entrances to the town, and they could use resources to build walls, towers, or other structures. I made a whole sheet with building costs, required time, and rules for mining and lumber harvesting speeds. It got messier as time went on and players made more specific requests, so I kept having to look up what each structure required. But that ended up becoming a background element by the end of the game because the kobolds became the main attraction. The players ended up making a deal with a group of kobolds to let them stay in town if they helped defend it. I intended to pull a "you got more than you bargained for" situation. The kobolds set up a shrine to Tiamat, but none of the players passed their religion checks, so they didn't know who Tiamat was and thought, well, these kobolds seem cool, so their goddess must be cool too. When waves would attack, some monsters would fall into kobold traps, and the living ones would be dragged to the shrine to be sacrificed for Tiamat's favor. The players were just like, yeah, go Tiamat! Thanks for helping with the monsters, little guys. The kobolds had even opened a tunnel outside of the walls, and I started hinting to the players that there were way more kobolds now living in tunnels beneath their city. They just went, "Hell yeah, the more the merrier." By the end, I was spending more time researching how long it takes to dig tunnels than to build lumber structures. But I had to do a ton of construction-related research too. I love to give my players risky decisions. I once made a feat for a druid at a small table that allowed her to wild shape into a random dragon. She'd roll to determine whether it would be a wormling or an ancient green dragon. I also set up a Jenga tower and wrote up a list for how many blocks she'd need to pull for each action she wanted to take or each dragon form. For example, flying, attacking, using breath weapons, or getting attacked would each trigger her to pull a certain number of blocks from the tower, and the number would be higher depending on the type of dragon she morphed into. If the tower fell, she'd immediately morph back with 0 spell slots, X levels of exhaustion, etc. It was risky, but darn fun. Hey everybody, Brian Von VA checking in after the vid. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, ring that bell, and of course, if you'd like to support us during the holiday season as the winter draws in and autumn goes away, you can do so by joining in our membership program too. You don't have to do it. It would help us, but you never have to. You get early access to videos and possibly more. Sometimes outtakes, I do have a couple of those. Maybe some behind the scenes stuff. I haven't tinkered with it yet. We'll talk about that. That said, we do love and value every single one of you, and I truly hope that all of you are staying safe, happy, and healthy. See you next time, and toodaloo for now.